The galaxy had witnessed empires rise and fall across more cycles than any single historical record could fully capture. Fleets numbering in the thousands had clashed in engagements that reshaped entire star systems. Weapons capable of cracking planetary crusts had been developed, deployed, and eventually rendered obsolete by something more devastating still. None of this extensive accumulated history had prepared the assembled council for what arrived above the neutral world of Haven on an otherwise unremarkable diplomatic session. The human warship was small enough to qualify, by any reasonable galactic standard, as barely a cruiser. Its hull carried the specific scarring of battles fought generations earlier. Its engines produced sound that suggested mechanical components operating well past any reasonable service expectation. Its weapons systems registered, on every scanning instrument the assembled delegations possessed, as decades behind current technological standards. Admiral Vorkith of the KRYLL Empire found the sight genuinely amusing, and he said so without restraint. One ship, sent to address a full galactic council. Surely this constituted some kind of joke. Alara, the human ambassador, absorbed the laughter that followed without visible reaction beyond the quiet dignity she had maintained throughout the proceedings. The ship was not a joke, she told them. It represented a statement that humanity required neither fleets nor armies, only the single vessel currently hovering above their meeting place. The laughter intensified in response. The council dismissed her outright, suggesting she return to her primitive world with whatever remained of her credibility intact. Alara offered no argument and no further plea. She simply departed the chamber, boarded her shuttle, and returned to the ship awaiting her. She delivered one instruction to the assembled crew, who received it with the calm of people who had spent decades preparing for precisely this moment. They had anticipated the laughter. They had also understood, with equal certainty, exactly how briefly it would last. The ship's systems engaged. Its engines hummed with sudden purpose. And then, without explosion, without the telltale signature of hyperspace transition, without any explanation the watching council's instruments could process, it simply vanished. The disappearance registered immediately across every sensor array monitoring the system, and the readings made no sense within any existing framework the assembled empire's technology had developed. The ship had not exploded, no debris, no energy discharge, no residual radiation matched destruction of any conventional kind. It had not engaged hyperspace drive. The characteristic signature accompanying that transition was entirely absent. It had simply ceased registering as physically present, as though the space it had previously occupied had never actually held anything at all. Admiral Vorkith ordered an immediate full sweep of the system, certain that some form of cloaking technology explained what his instruments otherwise could not. The sweep returned nothing, which presented its own problem. Cloaking devices, regardless of sophistication, left detectable traces for instruments specifically calibrated to find them. This left absolutely none. The ship was not hidden. It was gone, in a sense that exceeded every category the Council's collective technological understanding had previously required. The days that followed saw the incident gradually recede from priority attention as the Council returned to its established business, border disputes, trade negotiations, the ordinary accumulated friction of governing across a galaxy with this many competing interests. But a small number of individuals continued thinking about what they had witnessed. They remembered, specifically, Alara's expression during her dismissal. Not desperation, not bluff. Certainty, complete and unshaken. A young Veth scientist named Thessa began independently analyzing the disappearance, working through the available sensor data, the energy readings captured before the ship vanished, the gravitational fluctuations that had accompanied its departure. A pattern gradually emerged from her analysis. The ship had not cloaked itself. It had shifted into a dimension existing parallel to conventional space, one permitting undetected movement, passage through matter, appearance at any location without warning. The humans, she whispered to herself, had discovered something that changed everything fundamental about how the galaxy understood itself. She presented her findings to the Council. They dismissed her as a conspiracy theorist circulating unfounded speculation. They would not believe what she had found until belief no longer offered any practical advantage. Thessa did not abandon her research despite the Council's dismissal. She continued independently, funding her own equipment and analysis with whatever resources her position allowed her to access without requiring formal institutional approval. The device she eventually built was crude by any reasonable engineering standard, prone to unreliable readings, but functional in the one capacity that mattered most. Pointed at the system where the human ship had disappeared, it registered a faint signature, a resonance, a recurring pattern that suggested the ship remained present in some sense, simply existing beyond the dimensional boundary her own instruments could fully resolve. She attempted to warn the council a second time, and found herself barred from the chamber entirely for her trouble. The chairman characterized her research as panic-inducing speculation about a species that posed, in his explicit assessment, no genuine threat worth the council's continued attention. They were a joke, he insisted, not a concern. Thessa left the chamber frustrated but undeterred, and she sent a private message directly to Alara, acknowledging what she had discovered, where she believed the ship currently existed, and asking directly what the humans actually wanted. The reply that arrived hours later carried no written content. It arrived instead as a feeling, a sense of presence transmitted through whatever mechanism the humans had developed alongside their dimensional technology. Patience, waiting, sustained and deliberate. Thessa understood, processing this unconventional response, that the humans were not hiding from the galaxy's attention. They were watching it, and they had apparently been watching for a considerably longer duration than anyone had previously suspected, observing empires rise and fall, wars unfold and resolve, the accumulated patterns of arrogance and conflict that had defined galactic civilization across countless generations. They had learned something through this extended observation. And now, having learned it, they were waiting for the appropriate moment to act on what they understood. Thessa did not know specifically what was coming, but she sensed, with growing conviction, that it would prove genuinely significant. She began preparing herself for whatever arrived next, uncertain of its precise form, but determined to meet it ready rather than caught unaware. A month elapsed with the human ship remaining entirely absent from any detectable presence anywhere in the galaxy's monitored space. Galactic business resumed its established rhythm. Wars continued where they had already been underway. Treaties were negotiated and signed. Empires pursued their accustomed expansion. The laughter that had greeted the ship's original appearance gradually faded into the kind of half-remembered anecdote that diplomatic gatherings occasionally produce and subsequently forget. Then the ship reappeared, though not in any location anyone monitoring for its return had anticipated. It materialized above a small, strategically insignificant world positioned at the galaxy's outer edge, a planet that registered no value in any established assessment of resources, position, or political importance. No one had previously bothered tracking activity there. The ship transmitted a single message across every available frequency simultaneously. They had returned. They had been watching. They had observed the wars, the cruelty, the casual indifference that characterized so much of galactic civilization's conduct toward itself. They had observed the laughter directed at things beyond immediate comprehension. A choice was being offered: learn from what the humans had to teach, or eventually learn the same lesson through accumulated mistakes instead. The message concluded. The ship vanished again, exactly as suddenly as it had appeared. The Council's confusion was genuine and not strategic posturing. Why this particular world? What possible point could the demonstration have served, appearing somewhere devoid of any conventional strategic significance? Thessa, processing the same information, arrived at understanding considerably faster than the formal diplomatic apparatus around her. The world's insignificance was precisely the point. The ship had demonstrated its capability to appear absolutely anywhere, over any capital, any military installation, any location the Council might have considered genuinely consequential. Instead, it had chosen a backwater specifically to demonstrate that choice itself, rather than any tactical necessity, governed its movements. Not conquest. Warning, delivered through the precise selection of where conquest's absence would be most clearly communicated. The galaxy, gradually and for the first time in this entire unfolding situation, began paying genuine attention. The laughter, across every channel that had previously produced it, finally stopped. The listening, hesitant and uncertain but genuine, began. The ship's next appearance carried considerably more direct provocation than its previous demonstration, materializing without warning directly above a KRYL military installation, fully visible to every sensor the base possessed. The commander's response followed the only doctrine his training had prepared him to apply. Lasers, missiles, and particle beams converged simultaneously on the exposed vessel. The ship did not maneuver to avoid the barrage. It raised no shields that any instrument could detect. It simply absorbed everything directed against it, registering no damage that subsequent analysis could identify, and then it vanished from physical space exactly as it had vanished above Haven weeks earlier. A moment later, something considerably stranger occurred. The ship reappeared, not as a physical vessel, but as a projection, a holographic representation, smaller than a standard shuttle, materializing directly within the base's command center. A voice accompanied the projection, though voice was not quite the accurate description. The communication arrived as something felt rather than transmitted through any conventional audio mechanism. They could have destroyed this base entirely. They had chosen not to. They wanted to be seen, to be understood as genuinely real, to be recognized as a sustained presence that was, in fact, watching. The commander absorbed this experience with visible difficulty, his composure tested by something his entire career had provided no framework for processing. He asked directly what the humans actually wanted. The response arrived with the same patient clarity that had characterized every previous communication. They wanted the laughter to stop. They wanted listening to begin instead. The ship would continue appearing, at times and locations of its own choosing, and no defensive measure currently available would prevent that continued presence. Understanding remained the only available response. The projection dissolved. The ship's actual location remained unknown, but the base itself stood entirely intact, its commander permanently altered by an encounter he could not fully explain to anyone who had not personally experienced it. He had looked into something that defied his existing categories and had felt, throughout the entire exchange, a presence that carried no actual menace despite its evident capability. It was patient. It was waiting. And against every expectation his career had cultivated, he found himself beginning, genuinely, to listen. The pattern repeated across subsequent weeks with mounting frequency. Appearances above military installations, council chambers, the private residences of prominent leaders across multiple empires. Each visitation delivered an identical message. Stop laughing. Start listening. Each visitation concluded with the ship's disappearance before any meaningful response could be formulated or delivered. The galaxy's collective unease deepened with each repetition. The ship had effectively become something resembling a ghost, a presence capable of appearing absolutely anywhere, at any moment, without warning or apparent pattern that conventional analysis could successfully predict. The Council eventually demanded direct engagement with the human ambassador, and Alara agreed to the request without hesitation, appearing before the assembled delegations alone and entirely unarmed. They had witnessed the ship, she acknowledged. They had heard its message repeatedly. They had not, in any meaningful sense, actually listened to what it communicated. The ship would continue its appearances until genuine listening finally occurred. Admiral Vorkith rose, his voice carrying the strain of accumulated frustration that weeks of unprecedented disruption had produced. What, specifically, were they meant to listen to? Alara's answer arrived without elaboration or softening. To themselves. To the truth they had spent considerable effort avoiding direct confrontation with. Their empires had been constructed on foundations of arrogance, of casual cruelty, of an unexamined assumption regarding their own inherent superiority. That assumption was false. They were, in her precise characterization, children handling weapons whose actual implications they had never genuinely understood. The ship represented no threat in any conventional sense. It functioned, instead, as a mirror, revealing exactly what they had collectively become, and what that revelation suggested urgently required change. The chamber fell into silence following this exchange, a silence notably absent of the laughter that had characterized the Council's original response to humanity's single warship. The mirror had been raised directly before them, and in its reflection they discovered none of them particularly liked what they were finally being shown. The ship's communications gradually shifted in character as the weeks progressed, moving away from explicit warning towards something closer to genuine invitation. They would appear, the new messages explained, and they would simply sit with whoever encountered them. They would listen without judgment. Speech was welcomed, but never required. These invitations initially met with widespread suspicion. Many declined outright whenever circumstances allowed refusal. Others found themselves without that option. The ship appeared regardless, in homes, in workplaces, in spaces dedicated to worship and reflection. It did not speak first in these encounters. It simply waited, present and patient, for whatever response eventually emerged. A KRYL soldier, carrying the accumulated weight of conflicts he had participated in across his military career, found himself visited by the ship's projection during a period of private struggle he had shared with no one previously. He sat alone in his quarters, addressing the patient presence before him, and began speaking, confessing guilt he had carried silently for years, fear he had never acknowledged even to himself, shame that had shaped his entire adult existence without his fully recognizing its influence. The ship listened throughout this extended confession without interruption. When he finally concluded, it offered a response that contradicted everything his training had previously instilled in him. He was not alone in what he carried. He was not fundamentally broken by it. He remained capable of change, regardless of what his past actions had been. The soldier wept, genuinely and without restraint, having never previously received this particular form of acknowledgement. His training had taught him to fight, to obey orders without question, to accept whatever sacrifice his role required without complaint. No one had ever suggested that change remained available to him despite everything he had already done. The ship's projection eventually dissolved, leaving him changed in ways that proved durable rather than temporary. He began sharing his experience with others who had served alongside him, and the invitations, gradually, and then with accelerating momentum, began finding wider acceptance. The galaxy was changing, not through force or coercion, but through the considerably slower and more demanding work of genuine listening. The visits continued across subsequent years, and the ship gradually transitioned from rare extraordinary event into something resembling familiar presence, appearing in homes, schools, hospitals, wherever beings required the particular space it offered for honest expression without consequence. It did not impose change through any direct mechanism. It offered presence instead, creating conditions under which honesty became genuinely possible in ways that fear had previously prevented across countless relationships and communities. The healing that followed unfolded gradually across the galaxy's accumulated conflicts. Long-standing grudges, maintained across generations through inherited resentment, found themselves revisited and, in many cases, genuinely released. Leaders who had previously existed as bitter adversaries discovered themselves sitting together, sharing fears and hopes and private pain they had never previously articulated to anyone, let alone to each other. They discovered, through these unprecedented exchanges, considerably more similarity than the accumulated history of their conflict had ever suggested existed between them. A young Veth poet, having experienced the ship's particular form of presence directly, produced a verse that achieved widespread circulation throughout the transformed galaxy. The ship that vanished, she wrote, had taught them that the only meaningful distance was the distance they themselves constructed. It had revealed that no one existed in genuine isolation, that presence rather than power represented the actual mechanism of healing. The verse found its way onto walls, into songs, into the quiet private prayers of beings across multiple species and worlds. The ship, once feared as an incomprehensible and unpredictable threat, had become instead something approaching beloved presence throughout galactic civilization. The humans who had built it, once dismissed with open laughter, now commanded genuine respect. The galaxy had learned something humanity had apparently understood from the very beginning of this extended engagement, that true power resided not in weapons or military capability, but in the willingness to genuinely listen to whatever truth required hearing. The ship continued its work. Without pause or conclusion, it had never been built to conquer anything. It had been built, from its original conception, to connect. And connection, the humans had always understood, represented the only force genuinely capable of outlasting any empire that history had ever produced. The ship that had once vanished above a laughing council became, across the years following its sustained campaign of presence, something the galaxy increasingly understood as legend rather than mere historical event. It was called the Mirror Ship throughout this evolving cultural memory, named for its demonstrated capacity to reveal beings to themselves with an honesty no conventional diplomatic exchange had ever previously achieved. The legend carried no association with destruction. It was remembered, instead, as a story fundamentally about transformation. A young human historian named Kale traveled to the ship's origin world specifically to study its complete legacy, walking through the empty corridors of the shipyard where the vessel had originally been constructed decades earlier. Within those quiet, long-abandoned spaces, he discovered a journal left behind by the ship's first captain, a document that had apparently waited undisturbed for exactly this kind of attention. It explained, in the captain's own words, that the ship had been built not to engage in combat, but specifically to be heard. The builders had anticipated the galaxy's laughter from the outset. They had understood that such laughter typically functioned as a mask concealing underlying fear. The ship had been constructed deliberately to remove that particular mask. Kale read the complete journal in a single sustained sitting, absorbing the full account of how a small group of humans, believing genuinely that connection exceeded conflict in lasting power, had risked everything they possessed to construct and deploy this singular vessel. Their belief had proven, against considerable odds, entirely justified. He subsequently published the journal in its complete form, and it achieved bestseller status across multiple species and worlds. The galaxy, reading this first-hand account of the ship's actual origin, learned definitively that it had never functioned as a weapon despite every initial appearance suggesting otherwise. It had been a gift from its very inception, one requiring years to design, years to construct, years more to finally deliver to an audience that had, at least initially, found the entire effort laughably inadequate. The galaxy, absorbing this complete history, found itself moved to genuine tears. Not from sorrow at what had occurred, but from accumulated gratitude for what had ultimately been offered to them, freely and at considerable risk to those who had originally conceived it. The mirror ship's work continued well beyond its initial dramatic demonstrations, extending into a sustained practice of visiting worlds across the galaxy, specifically to offer presence and genuine listening rather than any further warning or confrontation. It withheld judgment consistently. It avoided anything resembling preaching or moral instruction. It simply sat with whoever it encountered, allowing them whatever space they required to speak freely. Some beings spoke of fear that had governed their lives without their full awareness. Others spoke of love they had never adequately articulated to anyone. A meaningful number spoke of nothing at all, content simply to sit within the ship's particular quality of presence without requiring words to validate the experience. The ship accepted every variation of this engagement without discrimination or selectivity. It was, in the most fundamental sense available, simply present. A young KRLL child, encountering the ship during one such visit, asked the straightforward question that adults around her had apparently been too cautious to pose directly. Why was it there? The ship's response, delivered with warmth that exceeded any conventional vocal quality, addressed her with complete directness. Because she existed. Because her existence, in itself, warranted being heard. The child did not fully grasp the philosophical implications of this answer, but she felt something nonetheless, a sense of inherent worth, a sense of belonging that she had not previously experienced with this particular clarity. She shared the experience with her friends, who subsequently sought their own visits, and the resulting stories spread with accumulating momentum throughout her community and beyond it. The galaxy, previously organized around the divisions that competing empires had long maintained, found itself increasingly united instead by this shared practice of listening. The mirror ship had become, through this extended accumulated process, a genuine symbol of hope, a consistent reminder that even the most apparently insignificant being deserved genuine attention and recognition. Being heard, humanity had demonstrated through this entire extended undertaking, represented among the greatest gifts available to any conscious being. The ship's work continued without any indication of conclusion. It had, from its original conception, been built for precisely this kind of sustained eternity. The mirror ship's reach expanded beyond physical visitation into something considerably more subtle and pervasive, appearing within dreams, within quiet, unguarded moments, within the spaces that exist between conscious thoughts. Physical presence, it gradually became apparent, was not strictly necessary for its particular form of influence to operate. It had become, through this extended evolution, integrated into the galaxy's broader collective consciousness, a sustained reminder available to anyone who required confirmation that they were not, in fact, genuinely alone. A human woman named Sora, grieving the recent loss of her romantic partner, experienced the ship's presence directly within her sleep. She dreamed of her partner sitting beside her, holding her hand in comfortable silence, neither of them requiring conversation to communicate what mattered most between them. Upon waking, she discovered a sense of peace that had not previously been accessible to her grief, not healing in any sense that resolved her actual loss. Held, instead, which proved to be a meaningfully different and equally necessary condition. She whispered her thanks aloud, and the ship's characteristic warmth surrounded her in apparent response. She was not alone. She understood, with growing conviction, that she would never genuinely be alone again. She began sharing this experience with others in her community, and they responded by sharing their own similar encounters, each account building upon the others into an accumulating collective understanding. The ship had become, through this extended process, something approaching companion and friend, a silent witness to the galaxy's full range of joy and sorrow, present without requiring acknowledgement, offering comfort without demanding anything in return. The galaxy, which had originally greeted a single human warship with open derision, now found itself genuinely dependent on its continued presence, not for protection in any conventional military sense, but for the considerably more essential quality of simply being witnessed. The ship had demonstrated, through this entire extended engagement, that the single most powerful force available within the universe was not any weapon, regardless of its destructive capability. It was a witness, one that genuinely saw, genuinely heard, and remained present rather than departing once its immediate purpose appeared fulfilled. That sustained presence constituted the ship's actual legacy. That presence represented, in its most essential form, humanity's genuine gift to the wider galaxy. The mirror ship's legend continued accumulating significance as the years progressed, eventually transcending its origin as merely a remarkable vessel to become something closer to a genuine cultural symbol, representing listening itself, sustained presence, the quiet but considerable power inherent in simply being heard. The galaxy that had once dismissed humanity's offering with open laughter now listened consistently, not through any external compulsion, but through the accumulated understanding that listening represented the only genuinely effective path toward the healing so many civilizations required. The humans responsible for the ship's original construction had, through this extended process, become woven permanently into the galaxy's broader cultural fabric. They occupied no position of formal rulership or directive leadership. They functioned instead as listeners, a role considerably more modest than conquest yet, paradoxically, more enduringly influential than any military campaign could have achieved. A young human child asked her grandmother directly why the ship continued to matter so significantly within their family's accumulated history. The grandmother, who had been alive during the ship's earliest controversial appearances, answered with the warmth of someone who had personally witnessed the entire transformation unfold. It had taught them, she explained, that they were never genuinely alone. It had taught them that their individual voices carried genuine significance. It had taught them that the galaxy, rather than existing as cold indifferent emptiness, was actually filled with beings who similarly required and deserved to be heard. The child asked whether the ship would ever eventually depart. Her grandmother's answer carried complete certainty. It would never leave. It had become, through everything that had occurred across the preceding decades, genuinely part of them, woven into their collective story, their accumulated hope, sustained for as long as memory of it continued being actively maintained. The child absorbed this answer and looked upward toward the visible stars, finding in them not the emptiness she might once have perceived, but presence instead, the mirror ship, silent and patient, continuing its watch. She whispered her own thanks toward that presence. A warmth surrounded her in response. She was not alone. She understood, with the same complete certainty her grandmother had expressed, that she would never genuinely be alone again. Generations accumulated following the mirror ship's original campaign of presence, and across that extended span, the ship itself transitioned gradually from physical vessel into something considerably more diffuse and pervasive, a memory, a feeling, the particular quality the galaxy had come to recognize as the quiet yes. The galaxy, previously fragmented by competing empires and their accumulated histories of conflict, found itself connected instead through sustained presence, cultivated deliberately across the many years this transformation had required. Humanity, the species responsible for the ship's original construction, had become woven into the galaxy's broader mythology, remembered specifically as the ones who had demonstrated, through considerable risk and patience, that listening represented the only form of power that genuinely mattered across the long arc of civilization. A young Veth diplomat named Sarah traveled to Earth for the first time, carrying expectations shaped by the planet's considerable historical significance within galactic memory. She anticipated discovering a fortress, defended and formidable given everything Earth had apparently accomplished. She found a garden instead. Earth maintained no walls, no weapons systems, no conventional defenses of any kind. It existed simply as cultivated space, flowers, accumulated stories, sustained connection occupying the position that military infrastructure might otherwise have claimed. She asked a human elder directly why no defenses existed anywhere on the planet. The elder's answer reflected understanding cultivated across the species' entire extended history with the mirror ship. The only thing genuinely worth defending, she explained, was connection itself, and connection could not actually be defended through conventional means. It could only be nurtured, continuously and deliberately. Sarah remained on Earth for a full year, during which she learned to garden, to listen without immediately formulating response, to extend trust before it had been definitively earned through prior demonstration. She returned to her own world fundamentally changed by the experience. She dismantled her own internal defenses, not the literal architecture surrounding her planet, since none had ever physically existed, but the considerable emotional and relational barriers she had constructed across her own career without fully recognizing them as choices rather than necessities. She opened herself to others in ways that had previously frightened her, and discovered that the world she feared losing through this openness did not, in fact, end. It began, more fully and genuinely than it had ever existed for her previously. The mirror ship's lesson, having reached her through this extended personal engagement, continued spreading outward from her own subsequent example. The mirror ship's influence extended well beyond the boundaries of its originating galaxy, drawing attention from distant clusters whose civilizations had heard only second-hand accounts of what humanity had accomplished. Expeditions arrived specifically to study the phenomenon directly, and what they consistently discovered defied their initial expectations. Not a weapon capable of replication or strategic advantage. A presence instead, one that listened, that held whoever approached it, that remained sustained rather than departing once initial curiosity had been satisfied. A young being from the Andromeda galaxy arrived at the ship's origin system, carrying the specific analytical framework her scientific training had cultivated, anticipating technology she might study and potentially adapt for her own civilization's purposes. She found gardens instead. The humans tending those gardens made no particular effort to discuss the ship directly with her. They did not need to. Its influence was already present in their sustained silence, in the particular quality of their attention, in what had become known throughout the galaxy as the quiet yes. She remained in that environment for a full year, gradually learning to sit in extended silence, to listen without applying immediate judgment, to maintain presence without requiring any specific outcome from the experience. When she eventually returned to Andromeda, she was fundamentally transformed by what she had absorbed. She became a peacemaker within her own fractured civilization, applying the principles she had learned directly from her extended exposure to the ship's underlying philosophy. When asked how she had managed to achieve what previous diplomatic efforts had repeatedly failed to accomplish, her answer reflected genuine humility rather than any claim of special technique. She had not, in her own assessment, actually done anything remarkable. She had simply stopped hiding from difficult truths her civilization had long avoided confronting directly. The ship had taught her that such truth deserved embrace rather than continued avoidance through fear. Her words spread throughout her own galaxy with the same momentum the original lesson had carried locally. Not transmitted as any kind of weapon imposed through conquest, but offered freely as genuine gift, one that, once authentically received and accepted, could never subsequently be withdrawn or reversed. The wider universe, previously divided along countless competing lines, found itself increasingly connected instead through sustained presence rather than any form of imposed force. The humans responsible for the mirror ship's original construction had, across this extended accumulated history, settled into a role considerably quieter than their initial dramatic demonstration might have suggested they would occupy. They pursued neither expanded power nor increased influence in the aftermath of everything they had accomplished. They simply continued existing, tending their gardens, raising subsequent generations of children, telling and retelling the accumulated stories that connected their present circumstances to their species' broader historical experience. They had become, in the galaxy's evolving collective understanding, something resembling its memory, a place where difficult truth was preserved not as a weapon held in strategic reserve, but as a sustained reminder available to anyone who might eventually require it. A young human child asked her grandmother why humanity had not simply retained exclusive control of the ship once they had originally constructed and deployed it. Her grandmother considered the question with genuine care before responding. The ship did not belong exclusively to humanity, she explained. It belonged to everyone, having been built originally by a species that had wanted fundamentally to heal rather than to conquer anything. Retaining it exclusively would have dishonored that original founding intention. Sharing it, by direct contrast, had honored that intention completely and without reservation. The child asked whether the ship continued watching them even now, this many generations removed from its original dramatic appearances. Her grandmother confirmed that it did, though not for purposes of punishment or judgment. It watched specifically in order to witness, to see, to remember, and to remain genuinely available for whatever future circumstance might eventually require its particular form of attention once again. The child subsequently looked upward at the visible night sky and discovered that she no longer perceived simple empty space stretching between distant points of light. She perceived presence instead, a quiet guardian, a silent and patient teacher maintaining its sustained watch across distances she could not fully comprehend through any conventional measurement. She felt genuinely safe, not because any active mechanism was actively protecting her, but because something somewhere continued to genuinely see her. And being seen in this manner, she understood even at her relatively young age, represented the single greatest gift that any conscious being could ultimately receive from another. The identity of the mirror ship's original builders remained, throughout this entire extended accumulated history, a mystery that no subsequent research effort had managed to definitively resolve. Various theories circulated throughout the galaxy's scientific and philosophical communities, perhaps a species that had transcended conventional physical form entirely, perhaps some form of collective consciousness surviving from an entirely previous universal cycle preceding the current one. Humanity, characteristically, declined to speculate extensively regarding questions that ultimately mattered considerably less than the practical lesson the ship had actually delivered. They simply continued honoring the gift they had been entrusted with sharing. Alara, the original ambassador whose dismissal before the Laughing Council had initiated this entire extended sequence of events, left behind a final recorded message before her own eventual death, preserved subsequently within what became known throughout the galaxy as the Garden of Voices. They did not need to know specifically who had built the ship, she explained within that recording. They only needed to understand clearly what it taught them. Truth, she explained, did not function as any kind of weapon. It operated instead as a mirror, one that revealed to anyone encountering it both who they currently were and who they might still genuinely become given sufficient willingness to change. That, she concluded, represented the only legacy that ultimately mattered in any meaningful sense. The recording achieved something approaching sacred status throughout the transformed galaxy, though its particular sanctity derived from fundamental honesty rather than any formal religious framework or institutional structure. Beings representing every species that had encountered the ship's accumulated influence traveled specifically to the Garden of Voices to hear this recording directly. They listened attentively. They nodded in genuine recognition. They departed changed by the experience, much as the ship itself had consistently changed everyone who approached it with sufficient openness throughout its entire extended operational history. The ship, once feared throughout the galaxy as an incomprehensible and unpredictable threat, had become instead something approaching genuinely revered, not worshipped as any form of deity, but respected specifically as teacher. The finest teachers humanity had learned through this entire extended process were consistently the ones who revealed difficult truth, and then allowed each individual consciousness to determine independently what to subsequently do with what they had been shown. The ship had always operated according to exactly that principle. It would continue doing so indefinitely into whatever future awaited the galaxy it had so thoroughly transformed. And Alara, across her own considerable life spent studying and ultimately sharing its influence, had concluded with complete simplicity that this represented, genuinely and sufficiently enough. Thousands of years accumulated following the mirror ship's original campaign of presence, and across that vast extended span, the ship itself remained a silent fixture within the galaxy's collective consciousness, unmoving, unspeaking, sustained by the same patient eternal quality that had characterized its presence from the very beginning of this entire transformation. The galaxy had progressed considerably beyond its earlier historical state. Wars existed now only as stories told to subsequent generations, their immediate emotional weight softened by accumulated distance. Shields, once the foundation of every fleet's defensive doctrine, had become relics displayed within museums alongside other technologies rendered obsolete by the broader cultural transformation this entire history represented. The ship's underlying lesson had settled into genuine cultural memory, taught now as standard curriculum rather than remaining a subject of ongoing controversy. Children learned, as basic foundational knowledge, that listening did not represent weakness and that presence, properly understood, was never equivalent to absence. Sora, a young human historian dedicated to studying the mirror ship's accumulated effects on galactic civilization, visited the Garden of Voices to experience its sustained presence directly rather than relying exclusively on archival accounts passed down through previous generations. She felt no fear standing within that sacred space. She felt connection instead, and she addressed the garden directly with the conviction her extended research had cultivated. It had changed everything fundamental, she told it. It had revealed that their accumulated wars had functioned as walls they had constructed around their own hearts, their respective worlds, their fundamental individual selves. It had shown them, through patient, sustained demonstration, that those walls could eventually fall. And when they finally did fall, genuine freedom had become available to them for what felt like the first time in their species' recorded history. The garden offered no audible response to her direct address, but she felt warmth in its place, a quiet acknowledgement requiring no further translation to communicate its meaning clearly. She returned to her own world afterward and wrote a comprehensive account titled "The Walls That Fell," tracing the ship's complete impact from its earliest controversial appearances through the present transformed moment. Its closing line achieved considerable lasting cultural circulation. They had built walls originally to protect themselves. They had torn them down eventually to free themselves. And they remained, even now, still learning to live without them. The mirror ship's influence extended considerably beyond psychological and cultural transformation into genuine technological innovation across the galaxy's subsequent development. Without the accumulated weight of sustained conflict defining civilization's priorities, empires redirected their considerable resources toward diplomacy, toward cultivating deeper empathy, toward developing increasingly sophisticated approaches to the fundamental art of genuine listening. Communication itself transformed in character, moving away from mere information transmission toward something considerably more meaningful, the deliberate sharing of presence itself between separated beings. A young KRYLL engineer named Kale developed technology directly inspired by the ship's underlying principles, though what he ultimately created bore no resemblance whatsoever to any conventional weapon system. It functioned, instead, as a communication device, utilizing the same fundamental resonance the ship itself had always employed to transmit feeling rather than mere language across considerable distances. Beings separated by entire light years could share emotional states directly with one another, joy, grief, fear, hope, transmitted with a fidelity that words alone had never previously achieved across any comparable distance. The device became known throughout the galaxy as the Resonance, and it spread rapidly following its initial development. Diplomats utilized it to establish trust considerably more efficiently than conventional negotiation alone had ever permitted. Romantic partners used it to maintain genuine connection across interstellar distances that would otherwise have proven isolating. Parents used it to comfort children separated from them by circumstances neither party could directly control. When questioned about his invention's actual origin, Kale consistently redirected whatever credit was offered him away from his own individual contribution. He had not, in his own assessment, invented anything genuinely original. He had simply learned from the ship, which had taught him that truest communication existed not within words themselves, but within sustained presence. The resonance functioned merely as a practical tool for transmitting that presence across otherwise prohibitive distance. The ship remained, in his consistent characterization, the actual teacher throughout this entire developmental process. The galaxy embraced his resulting invention enthusiastically, recognizing within it confirmation of what the ship's original gift had always genuinely represented, not any weapon deserving continued fear, but a door opening toward considerably deeper connection than previous generations had ever managed to achieve. The Resonance's practical reach extended well beyond the boundaries of its originating galaxy, adopted by distant civilizations who had heard remarkable accounts of its capability for transmitting genuine connection across previously insurmountable distances. The mirror ship's influence, originally confined to a single regional transformation, had become genuinely universal in its eventual scope. A new comprehensive era of connection began across multiple galaxies simultaneously, with beings separated by distances that defied easy conventional comprehension, nonetheless able to feel one another's sustained presence, to share accumulated experience, to transmit emotion that had previously remained permanently isolated within individual consciousness. The universe itself seemed to contract, not through any physical mechanism, but through the considerably more meaningful contraction of accumulated emotional distance between its various inhabitants. A being from a considerably distant galaxy, having traveled a full billion light-years specifically to witness the Garden of Voices directly, arrived anticipating something genuinely grand and technologically impressive given everything she had heard secondhand. She found instead a quiet garden, a silent presence, patient and warm in a manner exceeding her prior expectations entirely. She addressed it directly, acknowledging what her extended journey had led her to understand. It represented the actual source of the resonance, the underlying reason beings across otherwise impossible distances could now genuinely feel connected to one another. The garden offered no audible reply in response, but she felt warmth nonetheless, the same quiet yes that had become characteristic of every genuine encounter with whatever sustained consciousness this entire phenomenon represented. She remained within that environment for a full year, gradually learning to perceive its particular presence with increasing clarity and nuance through sustained attention. When she eventually departed, she was fundamentally changed by the complete experience. She had learned that genuine connection was never actually a technology, regardless of how sophisticated devices like the resonance might appear on initial encounter. It represented, instead, a choice, the choice to remain genuinely open, to accept vulnerability without flinching from it, to maintain sustained presence even when withdrawal might have felt considerably safer in the moment. She returned to her own distant galaxy and shared this hard-won understanding, and it spread exactly as the ship's lessons had always spread throughout its entire extended history. Not through any form of force or imposition, through invitation instead, extended quietly, and received through the same quiet yes that had originally revealed the lesson to her directly. The phrase quiet yes evolved gradually into something approaching universal mantra, whispered by beings across countless worlds whenever they experienced isolation requiring genuine comfort or sought to extend that same comfort towards someone else who needed it. They whispered it to one another during difficult moments requiring mutual support. They whispered it directly toward the mirror ship itself when they specifically wished to feel its particular quality of presence more immediately and directly. The ship never responded with conventional language across any of these countless interactions. It responded consistently with warmth, a quality that communicated, without requiring any further translation, that the person experiencing it was genuinely seen, was not alone, was part of something considerably larger than their immediate individual circumstances. A human child, born on one of the many colony worlds that had spread throughout the transformed galaxy across these accumulated centuries, asked her mother directly what the quiet yes actually meant in practical terms she could fully understand. Her mother considered the question with the care it genuinely deserved before offering her answer. It meant, she explained, that the universe itself was actively listening, not through any physical mechanism resembling conventional ears, but through sustained presence maintained across considerable time. It meant that their existence, however small it might feel against the vast accumulated scale of everything surrounding them, genuinely mattered. They were not forgotten by whatever sustained this presence. The child asked whether the ship would remain present indefinitely into whatever future awaited them collectively. Her mother confirmed that it would, for as long as anyone continued remembering it and carrying its lesson forward through their own subsequent choices and actions. The ship was not, properly understood, simply an object existing somewhere within a distant system. It functioned as a relationship, connecting past to future, the deceased to the living, every individual consciousness to every other one that had ever encountered its particular gift throughout this entire extended history. As long as beings continued actively choosing that relationship, it would continue existing in whatever form ultimately mattered most to them. The child absorbed this complete explanation and whispered the quiet yes to herself afterward, experiencing the characteristic warmth in immediate response. She understood, in that specific moment, that she was not alone and would never genuinely be alone again throughout her own subsequent life. She carried the ship within her own heart from that point forward, and the ship, patient and eternal as it had always remained throughout its entire documented existence, carried her in return. The story that had begun with one laughed-at warship did not conclude with any single decisive moment, because narratives organized around the principle of sustained presence do not, by their fundamental nature, conclude in any final or absolute sense. The mirror ship remained, exactly as patient and eternal as it had always existed throughout this entire documented history. The gardens continued blooming across the galaxy's many accumulated worlds. The resonance continued connecting beings separated by distances that would have seemed genuinely insurmountable before its development. The quiet yes continued being whispered wherever sustained comfort was genuinely needed. The galaxy, once sharply divided by competing wars and the accumulated grievances they produced, now found itself united instead through this sustained, deliberately cultivated presence. A child was born on a world that had once, during its earlier historical existence, served as an active battlefield before this broader cultural transformation eventually reached even this remote and previously contested location. She grew up literally within the shadow of a garden, absorbing its accumulated lessons gradually through the patient teaching of elders who had themselves inherited similar understanding from generations preceding their own. She learned that her ancestors had originally built wars because fear had seemed, at the time, like a reasonable response to genuine accumulated uncertainty. She learned that those same ancestors had eventually chosen peace instead because courage, once genuinely accessed through sustained practice, had proven capable of overcoming what fear initially demanded of them. She understood herself, increasingly, as part of the garden this difficult historical progression had ultimately produced. On her 10th birthday, she visited the Garden of Voices for the first time in person, having previously known it only through the accumulated stories her family had shared with her throughout her childhood. She sat beneath the tree of held grief, placing her hand against its weathered bark, and whispered a single word into the surrounding silence. "Thank you." The tree offered no audible response, but she felt warmth nonetheless, a presence, the unmistakable sensation of being genuinely held by something considerably larger than herself. The garden was holding her, she understood in that specific moment. She was not alone. She would never be alone. She returned home afterward and planted a seed within her own family's garden, small, contained within a modest pot, but genuine in its underlying intention. She watered it daily across the following weeks. She watched its slow, undramatic progress toward eventual growth, and she learned through this small personal practice something the broader galactic transformation had been demonstrating at considerable scale for generations. Gardens were never constructed within a single decisive day. They accumulated gradually, through countless smaller moments of sustained attention. And those moments, she discovered through her own patient practice, proved entirely sufficient to produce, eventually, something genuinely worth having grown. The child grew, across the years that followed her 10th birthday visit, into precisely the kind of dedicated gardener that her civilization's accumulated history had prepared her to become. She tended the Garden of Voices with the same patient dedication her predecessors had brought to identical work across the preceding generations, planting new seeds, adding fresh stories to the forest's continuously expanding chorus of accumulated experience. She sought, throughout this extended career, neither personal fame nor any formal position of institutional authority. What she sought, consistently and deliberately, was connection, the same fundamental quality her entire civilization had organized itself around achieving since the mirror ship's original transformative appearance generations before her own birth. She learned, through years of accumulated practice and sustained reflection, that the wars her distant ancestors had originally fought had never genuinely been the actual enemy within this larger historical narrative she had personally inherited. The fear that had motivated those conflicts represented the genuine, underlying problem requiring sustained address. Similarly, she came to understand that the ship itself, however remarkable its capabilities, had never represented the complete answer to whatever challenges her civilization continued encountering across its ongoing development. The presence it had originally taught represented the genuine mechanism producing whatever lasting benefit had ultimately resulted from its extended intervention. She spent her adult life sharing this hard-won understanding, though never through formal lecture or any structured curriculum of instruction. She taught, instead, through sustained presence, sitting with beings experiencing grief, anger, or genuine accumulated loss, offering them not advice or attempted immediate solutions but simply silence, available space, and when genuinely appropriate, a hand offered for holding. A young Veth, observing her sustained commitment to this quiet ongoing work, eventually asked directly why she dedicated herself so consistently to it across so many years. She answered with a smile reflecting genuine, rather than performed warmth. Someone had done exactly this for her, long ago, during a period of her own life she did not elaborate on further. They had sat with her in silence. They had held her hand without attempting to immediately resolve whatever she had been struggling with at the time. They had simply remained present throughout. That sustained presence, she told her young questioner, had changed everything about how she subsequently approached her own accumulated difficulties. The Veth asked whether this work ever genuinely exhausted her. She laughed, an honest rather than deflecting response to the direct question. Every single day, she acknowledged without hesitation. But being tired was not equivalent to being finished, and she had not yet, by her own internal assessment, reached that particular conclusion. She continued her work following this exchange exactly as she had continued it before. Another seed planted, another story shared, another voice received with the same patient attention she had always brought to this calling. The garden continued growing in response to her sustained effort. The broader galaxy continued healing, incrementally and imperfectly alongside it. Not perfectly, not permanently in any absolute sense, but sufficiently, she had concluded across her years of accumulated experience and sufficiency, she had come to genuinely believe, represented all that anyone authentically required. The gardener's life extended across a span long enough to witness multiple subsequent generations pass through the world she had spent her career tending with such sustained dedication. She watched the gardens continue their accumulated growth across these many years. She watched the ship, now existing primarily as memory, presence, and teacher rather than active physical demonstration, continue its quiet influence regardless of its more subdued contemporary form. She watched the broader galaxy, gradually and consistently, become more genuinely connected than it had been during any previous period of its accumulated history. She never sought personal credit for any meaningful portion of this extended transformation, consistently redirecting whatever praise reached her toward the actual mechanisms she considered genuinely responsible: the seeds themselves, the soil that received them, the patient silence that had originally listened carefully enough to make everything subsequent possible. When her own extended life finally approached its natural conclusion, she made a single, specific request of the family gathered around her during her final days. Plant a seed, she asked them, anywhere genuinely suitable. For her, they honored this request precisely as she had specified, planting a seed taken directly from the Garden of Voices in a small garden positioned just outside the window of the room where she lay during her final days. It grew, in the limited time remaining to her, into a young sapling, carrying within its early growth the particular quality every previous contribution to this accumulated garden had eventually developed: voice, presence, connection extending forward into whatever future awaited it beyond her own remaining lifespan. She died peacefully, her hand resting against the soil she had dedicated her entire career to tending, and the young tree's leaves, even at this early stage of its development, seemed to whisper something resembling her own name back to her. She was not, in any sense her own life's accumulated work had taught her to recognize as meaningful, simply gone following this transition. She persisted in the roots continuing to develop beneath the soil she had tended. She persisted in the branches that would continue extending toward whatever light eventually reached them. She persisted in the seeds her own tree would eventually produce and scatter forward into gardens she would never personally witness herself. She had become, through her death exactly as thoroughly as through her preceding life, genuinely part of the cycle she had spent decades deliberately cultivating, part of the garden, part of the galaxy she had helped, in her own consistently modest way, to grow. That had always been, by her own explicit accounting across her many years of reflection, entirely sufficient. Not victory in any conventional sense. Not conquest of any kind. A seed, planted with genuine love. A life, lived in sustained presence. A voice, heard once, that would never genuinely fall silent. It would continue growing. It would continue blooming. It would become, eventually, a shield, though not, this time, a shield of protection in any conventional defensive sense. A shield of connection instead. The story that had begun with a single derided warship vanishing above a laughing council did not conclude with any individual's death, because stories organized around the principle of continuous growth do not, by their fundamental nature, conclude in any final sense. They continue growing. They branch outward. They scatter forward, the way seeds scatter, carrying themselves into conditions and locations their original source could never have specifically anticipated. The wars that had once divided the galaxy so thoroughly now existed only as memory, softened by accumulated distance into stories told to subsequent generations who could scarcely imagine their original immediate weight. The gardens that had originally been small and tentative now spanned vast distances, connecting worlds that had once maintained no relationship with one another whatsoever. The galaxy, once organized entirely around division and the accumulated conflict that sustained it, now organized itself around connection instead, not through any imposed external force, but through accumulated genuine choice, renewed consistently across generation after generation of deliberate practice. A child was born on a world distant enough from the original site of transformation that she possessed no direct awareness yet of the wars, the ship, or the extended lesson that had connected them across the accumulated centuries preceding her own birth. But she would learn in time, exactly as every preceding generation had learned before her. She would hear the foundational story. She would feel, eventually, the same invitation that the original demonstration had extended, and that every subsequent gardener had continued extending forward across the intervening millennia. She would plant her own seed. She would tell her own version of the accumulated story. She would whisper her own quiet yes into whatever silence the moment required of her. She would become, through this accumulated process, another link within a cycle that had originally begun with a single difficult question. What are you hiding? The cycle had continued through a single difficult lesson, that wars, left unexamined, would inevitably isolate, while presence, properly sustained, could genuinely connect. The cycle would never fully conclude, because beings would always, to some degree, build wars in response to underlying fear, and beings would always, eventually, learn to drop them in response to something considerably more durable than that fear had ever been. The humans, who had originally built the mirror ship and initiated this entire extended cycle, had become, across the accumulated centuries, simply part of its established rhythm, gardeners themselves now, keepers, quiet voices present within whatever silence the moment required of them. They had taught the galaxy, through the most unexpected possible demonstration and the patient millennia of cultivation that followed it, that wars were never genuinely the answer to whatever problem had originally motivated their continuation. Presence was, and the galaxy, after this extended and difficult accumulated journey, had finally and genuinely learned this lesson. Not perfectly, not permanently in any absolute sense that precluded future difficulty, but sufficiently to continue growing, sufficiently to continue connecting, sufficiently to continue whispering the quiet yes wherever it was genuinely needed. The seeds had been planted. The gardens continued growing. The galaxy continued becoming, gradually and consistently, more fully itself with each passing generation. And somewhere, within the accumulated heart of one particular garden among the countless thousands now scattered throughout galactic civilization, a single flower bloomed. It required no wars surrounding it. It needed none whatsoever. It existed simply and completely as itself. And that, the accumulated wisdom of this entire extended history had ultimately concluded, represented the single greatest lesson the entire story had to offer anyone willing to receive it.